Marcus Thompson stood in line at the grocery store, his weathered hands gripping a basket filled with simple necessities. At 62, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen more than most, though few would guess his extraordinary past just by looking at him. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes clean but worn, and his eyes held a distant quality that spoke of memories both treasured and painful. The checkout line moved slowly on this Tuesday afternoon, giving the other customers plenty of time to notice the intricate tattoo that covered most of his left forearm. It was an unusual design that seemed to tell a story, featuring bold black lettering intertwined with military symbols, dates, and what appeared to be coordinates. The artwork was clearly professional, though it had the faded quality that comes with age and countless hours under the sun. Behind him, two college students whispered and pointed, barely containing their amusement. "Look at that old guy's tattoo," one of them snickered. "Probably thinks he's still some kind of tough guy from back in the day." His friend joined in, the quiet mockery, making jokes about wannabe soldiers and fake military guys trying to look cool. They assumed, like many others had before them, that Marcus was simply another aging man clinging to a fantasy of military service he'd never actually experienced. The woman in front of Marcus turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the tattoo as he reached for his wallet. She rolled her eyes and shook her head, muttering something under her breath about attention seekers and stolen valor. Her reaction was becoming all too familiar to Marcus, who had learned to ignore the stares and whispered comments that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. What none of these strangers could have known was that every line, every symbol, every carefully placed element of that tattoo represented something real and significant. The numbers weren't random coordinates chosen to look impressive. They marked specific locations where Marcus had served with distinction. The dates weren't picked for their aesthetic value. They commemorated moments that had changed the course of his life and the lives of countless others. Marcus had grown accustomed to these reactions over the years since he'd gotten the tattoo. He understood that people saw what they expected to see, making quick judgments based on assumptions rather than facts. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very people questioning his authenticity were often those who had never faced a day of real adversity in their lives, let alone the kind of challenges that had shaped his character in the crucible of military service. As he waited patiently for his turn at the register, Marcus reflected on the decision to get the tattoo 5 years earlier. It hadn't been a choice made lightly or for show. After decades of carrying his memories silently, he had finally decided to honor his fallen brothers and the missions that had defined his life in a way that would be with him always. The artist who had created the piece was a fellow veteran who understood the weight of each element, the significance of every detail that others dismissed as mere decoration. The young cashier barely looked up as Marcus approached, already forming her own opinions about the aging customer with the elaborate arm artwork. She processed his items mechanically, her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else than dealing with what she perceived as another old-timer trying to relive his glory days through body art. But unknown to everyone in that store, Marcus Thompson was not just any veteran. His service record was the stuff of legend among those who knew the truth about certain classified operations that had taken place decades earlier. The tattoo they were all dismissing so casually was actually a memorial to one of the most daring and successful rescue missions in Marine Corps history, a mission that Marcus had not only participated in, but had led with extraordinary courage and skill. As Marcus gathered his groceries and headed toward the exit, he caught the eye of another customer who had been watching the scene unfold. This man was different from the others. His posture, his bearing, the way his eyes had immediately focused on specific details of the tattoo rather than dismissing it outright. There was recognition there, and something that looked very much like respect beginning to form in his expression. The man who had been watching Marcus was Staff Sergeant David Rivera, currently on leave from his 3rd deployment overseas. Unlike the other customers in the store, David had been trained to notice details that others missed. When he spotted Marcus's tattoo, something about the specific combination of coordinates and dates had immediately caught his attention. These weren't random numbers chosen to impress civilians. They were real locations and real dates that meant something to someone who knew military history. David found himself following Marcus outside into the parking lot, not with any intention of confrontation, but driven by a growing curiosity that he couldn't shake. As a Marine himself, he had heard stories throughout his career about legendary operations and the heroes who had carried them out. There was something about this particular combination of markings that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place where he might have encountered them before. "Excuse me, sir," David called out as Marcus reached his old pickup truck. His voice carried the respectful tone that military training had ingrained in him when addressing someone who might be a senior service member. Marcus turned, unsurprised by the approach. He had learned to recognize active duty personnel even when they were in civilian clothes, and something about this young man's demeanor told him this wouldn't be another confrontation. David gestured toward the tattoo with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "I couldn't help but notice your ink in there. Those coordinates, they look familiar somehow. Mind if I ask where they're from?" His question was posed with the kind of respectful directness that one service member uses with another, a far cry from the snickering comments and dismissive glances Marcus had endured inside the store. Marcus studied the younger man for a moment, taking in the short haircut, the confident posture, and the way he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone currently serving. "You military?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. When David confirmed that he was a Marine, Marcus felt a familiar warmth that came from meeting someone who might actually understand the significance of what he carried on his arm. "The coordinates are from a place called Khao Idang," Marcus said simply, watching David's face for any sign of recognition. "Thailand, 1981. He didn't elaborate further at first, waiting to see if the location and date would mean anything to the young Marine. To Marcus's surprise, David's eyes widened slightly, and he took a step closer to get a better look at the detailed artwork. "Wait a minute," David said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Khao Idang, that was the refugee camp, wasn't it? Near the Cambodian border?" His knowledge of the location immediately elevated the conversation beyond casual curiosity. This wasn't just another person making assumptions about military service. This was someone who actually knew something about the history Marcus carried with him. Marcus nodded, feeling a mixture of surprise and relief that someone finally recognized the significance of what others had dismissed as mere decoration. "You know about the camp?" he asked, genuinely curious about how a Marine of David's generation would have learned about operations from decades before he was even born. The refugee camp at Khao Idang wasn't exactly common knowledge, even among current military personnel. "I studied Southeast Asian operations at the War College," David explained. "There were some incredible rescue missions that came out of that region in the early 80s. American personnel helping to evacuate refugees from the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge regime. Dangerous stuff, working so close to hostile territory." His knowledge was clearly more than superficial, and Marcus could see the wheels turning in the young Marine's mind as he began to piece together possibilities. David looked more closely at the other elements of the tattoo, noting additional dates and symbols that were starting to form a clearer picture. "Sir, were you part of those operations?" The question was asked with growing respect and more than a little awe. The rescue missions from that era were legendary among those who studied military history, known for their complexity, danger, and the extraordinary courage required to carry them out successfully. Marcus hesitated for a moment, not out of reluctance to share his story, but because he had grown so accustomed to disbelief and mockery that genuine interest felt almost foreign. "I was there," he said finally, "led a team that helped evacuate American civilians and Allied personnel when things got too hot near the border. It wasn't the kind of mission that made the evening news, if you know what I mean." The respect in David's expression was unmistakable now, and Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The recognition of one warrior by another. For the first time in a long while, someone was looking at his tattoo not as a source of amusement or skepticism, but as the memorial and badge of honor it was always meant to be. David's mind raced as he processed what Marcus had just revealed. The evacuation operations near the Thai-Cambodian border in 1981 were the stuff of Marine Corps legend, though the details remained classified even decades later. These weren't routine missions. They were desperate rescue operations carried out under extreme conditions. with teams operating behind enemy lines to save American civilians and Allied personnel caught in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. "Sir, I think I need to make a phone call," David said, his voice taking on an urgency that hadn't been there moments before. "Would you mind waiting here for just a few minutes? There's someone I need to talk to who would be very interested in meeting you." Marcus raised an eyebrow but nodded, curious about what had sparked such sudden intensity in the young Marine. David stepped away and pulled out his cell phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. On the other end, Colonel James Mitchell answered on the second ring. Mitchell was a decorated Marine officer who had spent years studying the classified operations of the 1980s and had become something of an unofficial historian for the Corps' most sensitive missions from that era. "Colonel, it's Rivera. I need you to listen carefully," David said, keeping his voice low but urgent. "I'm standing next to a man who claims he led evacuation operations at Khao Dang in 1981. He's got a tattoo with coordinates that match. And, sir, he knows details that aren't in any public records. I think this might be one of them. One of the guys from Operation Silent Thunder." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Operation Silent Thunder was so classified that even its name was known only to a handful of people. The fact that David was even mentioning it over an unsecured line spoke to the magnitude of what he believed he had discovered. "You're certain about the coordinates?" Mitchell asked, his voice tense with anticipation. "Positive, sir. And it's not just the numbers. This guy carries himself like someone who's seen real action. There's something about him, the way he talks, the way he stands. This isn't stolen valor, Colonel. This is the real deal." David glanced back at Marcus, who was patiently waiting by his truck, seemingly unbothered by the extended phone conversation. Colonel Mitchell was quiet for another moment, then made a decision that would change everything. "I'm 40 minutes away. Can you keep him there? And Rivera, if this is who I think it might be, you've just found someone we've been trying to locate for over 20 years. Someone the Marine Corps owes a debt it can never fully repay." When David returned to Marcus, his entire demeanor had changed. The casual respect he had shown before was now mixed with something approaching reverence. "Sir, I've contacted my commanding officer. He's very interested in meeting you, and he's on his way here now. Would you mind staying for a little while longer?" Marcus studied the young Marine's face, noting the change in his expression and tone. "What exactly did you tell him?" he asked, though something in David's urgency was beginning to stir memories that Marcus had kept carefully locked away for decades. He had spent so many years living quietly, avoiding attention, that the sudden interest felt both validating and slightly unsettling. "I told him about your tattoo, about the coordinates from Khao Dang," David said carefully. "Sir, Operation Silent Thunder. Does that name mean anything to you?" The question hung in the air between them, and Marcus felt something deep in his chest tighten. It had been more than 20 years since anyone had spoken that name in his presence. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as memories flooded back. Images of helicopters in the pre-dawn darkness, the faces of civilians whose lives hung in the balance, the weight of responsibility for a mission that could have sparked an international incident if it had gone wrong. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "From someone who spent his career studying what you and your team accomplished," David replied. "Sir, if you're who I think you are, then you're looking at a Marine who's read your after-action reports. Reports that are still classified at the highest levels. Reports that describe some of the most heroic actions in Marine Corps history." The two men stood in the parking lot, the afternoon sun beating down on them as decades of secrecy began to crumble. For Marcus, it was the first time in years that someone had looked at him and seen not just an aging veteran with questionable tattoos, but a Marine who had risked everything to save lives in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. For David, it was the realization that he was standing face to face with a living legend, a man whose exploits had been whispered about in Marine barracks around the world, but who had remained a ghost, a name in classified files that most people assumed was just another military myth. As they waited for Colonel Mitchell to arrive, David found himself studying Marcus with new eyes. The weathered hands that had gripped the grocery basket now took on new significance. These were the same hands that had rappelled from helicopters into hostile territory, that had guided terrified civilians to safety through jungle paths barely wide enough for single file. The quiet dignity that David had initially noticed was now revealed as the bearing of a man who had carried the weight of life and death decisions in some of the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The tattoo, David said softly, gesturing toward Marcus's arm. It's not just a memorial, is it? It's a map. As he looked more closely, he began to see what he had missed before. The coordinates weren't just marking the refugee camp. They traced a route, a path through territory that was supposed to be impossible to navigate safely. The dates corresponded to different phases of the mission, and the symbols weren't just decorative elements but actual tactical markings that would have meaning to someone who understood military operations. Marcus nodded slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the first time in years that someone had truly seen his tattoo for what it really was. Every mark on this arm tells part of the story, he said, rolling up his sleeve slightly to reveal additional details that had been hidden. The artist who did this work was a Marine too. He understood that this wasn't just art, it was history, my history, and the history of 12 good men who went into hell with me and came back home. 12 men, David repeated, his voice filled with awe. The reports mentioned a team of 13 for the primary extraction. You were the team leader. It wasn't a question. The pieces were falling into place now, and David was beginning to understand that he wasn't just talking to a participant in Operation Silent Thunder, but to the man who had planned and executed one of the most daring rescue missions in modern military history. As if summoned by their conversation, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot with the kind of purposeful precision that screamed, military. Colonel Mitchell emerged from the driver's seat, and even in civilian clothes there was no mistaking his bearing as that of a senior Marine officer. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of handling classified operations and sensitive situations. Mitchell approached the two men with measured steps, his eyes immediately fixing on Marcus's tattoo with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson, he said, using a rank and name that made David's eyes widen. This wasn't just any veteran, this was a senior, non-commissioned officer whose reputation had become the stuff of legend among those who knew the classified history of Marine Special Operations. It's just Marcus now, Colonel, Marcus replied, straightening slightly but not quite coming to attention. The automatic respect between military personnel was evident, but there was also a weariness in Marcus's voice that spoke to years of trying to leave his military identity behind. Been a long time since anyone called me Gunny. Not nearly long enough, in my opinion, Mitchell replied, his voice carrying genuine warmth and respect. Sir, I hope you don't mind, but I've spent the better part of my career studying what you and your team accomplished in Thailand. When Sergeant Rivera called and described your tattoo, I knew I had to meet you in person. The Marine Corps has been looking for you for over 20 years. Marcus looked puzzled. Looking for me? Why? The question seemed genuine, as if he couldn't imagine why the Marines would have any interest in tracking down a retired NCO who had simply been doing his job all those years ago. It was a humility that both David and Mitchell found remarkable, given the magnitude of what they knew Marcus had accomplished. Because what you did saved 47 lives, Mitchell said simply. 47 American civilians and Allied personnel who were trapped behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue through conventional means. The mission you led wasn't just successful, it was impossible. The after-action reports described tactical decisions and leadership under fire that are still being studied at the Command and Staff College today. David watched this exchange with growing amazement. He was witnessing the meeting between a living legend and the current generation of Marines who had been inspired by his actions. The parking lot of a suburban grocery store had become the stage for a moment of military history, as decades of separation between a hero and those who honored his memory finally came to an end. Sir, Mitchell continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, the Commandant of the Marine Corps has authorized me to invite you to Washington. There are some people who would very much like to meet you, and there are some honors that are long overdue. Would you consider coming with me? Marcus stood silent for a long moment, processing what Colonel Mitchell had just said. The invitation to Washington, the mention of overdue honors, the sudden attention after decades of anonymity. It was overwhelming for a man who had spent years trying to blend into civilian life. He looked down at his tattoo, then back at the two Marines who were watching him with expressions of genuine respect and anticipation. Colonel, I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm not sure I understand, Marcus said finally. I did my job same as thousands of other Marines have done before and since. What happened in Thailand was a long time ago, and those people we brought out, they went on to live their lives. That was reward enough for me. His humility was genuine, but both Mitchell and David could see something else in his expression, a deep weariness that suggested years of carrying memories alone. Mitchell exchanged a glance with David before continuing. Sir, with respect, what you accomplished wasn't just doing your job. The intelligence reports from that operation describe a mission that military planners said was impossible. The terrain was hostile, the enemy presence was overwhelming, and the extraction points were constantly changing due to enemy movement. You improvised solutions to problems that didn't have solutions, and you brought everyone home. Not everyone, Marcus said quietly, and for the first time, his composure cracked slightly. We lost Martinez on the second day, stepped on a mine that wasn't supposed to be there. The pain in his voice was evident even after all these years. It was clear that the loss of even one team member still haunted him, despite the lives that had been saved. David found his voice. Sir, the reports mention Corporal Martinez. They also mention how you carried him 3 miles through enemy territory to get him to a medical evacuation point, how you refused to leave him behind even when it meant risking the entire mission. He survived, sir. He made it home. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. What did you say? His voice was barely a whisper, and both Marines could see that this was news to him. Martinez survived? But the explosion, I saw the damage. There was so much blood. The emotional impact of this revelation was immediate and profound, and Marcus had to steady himself against his truck. He lost his leg, but he made it, Mitchell confirmed gently. He's actually one of the people who's been hoping to see you again. He's been telling people for 20 years that Gunnery Sergeant Thompson saved his life. Not just in that moment, but every day of the mission. He credits you with bringing him home to his family. The news about Martinez seemed to unlock something in Marcus that had been held tightly closed for decades. Tears formed in his eyes as he processed the information that his Marine had not only survived, but had been living a full life. I never knew, he said, his voice thick with emotion. After the mission, everything was classified. We were debriefed separately and told never to discuss what happened. I never found out what happened to any of the guys after we were discharged. Mitchell nodded understandingly. That's how these black operations work, sir. Operational security meant that team members were kept separate after the mission to prevent any leaks of classified information. But the classification level has been reduced now, and some of the details can be shared. More importantly, the men who served with you have been asking about you for years. David stepped forward. Sir, there's something else you should know. Your team, the Marines who served with you in Thailand, they've been meeting annually for the past 15 years. They call it the Thunder Reunion, and every year they drink a toast to their missing team leader. They've been trying to find you because they want to thank you personally for bringing them home. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what he was learning. The men he had led into danger and brought safely home had been thinking about him, honoring him, trying to find him while he had been living quietly, believing that his service had been forgotten. The isolation he had felt for so many years was suddenly revealed to be unnecessary, the result of classification protocols rather than indifference. These reunions, Marcus asked slowly, do they really drink a toast to me? The question revealed just how deeply the years of anonymity had affected him. He had carried the weight of that mission alone for so long that the idea of being remembered and honored by his fellow Marines seemed almost too good to be true. Every year, sir, Mitchell confirmed. And this year, if you're willing, you won't have to be a memory anymore. You can be there in person. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in the lobby of a hotel in Washington, D.C., wearing his dress blue uniform for the first time in over 2 decades. The uniform still fit, though it felt strange after years of civilian clothes. Colonel Mitchell had arranged for everything: the travel, the accommodations, and most importantly, the reunion that Marcus had never dared to hope for. The Thunder reunion was being held in a private dining room, and as Marcus approached the door, he could hear familiar voices inside. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the handle, 20 years of separation about to end in a matter of seconds. Mitchell stood beside him, offering quiet support and encouragement for what he knew would be an emotional moment. "They're all here, sir," Mitchell said softly. "All 11 of the surviving team members plus Martinez. They've been waiting for this day for a very long time." Marcus nodded, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The conversation in the room stopped immediately as 12 men turned to see their former team leader standing in the doorway. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then Martinez, walking with a slight limp but moving faster than his prosthetic leg should have allowed, crossed the room in quick strides and wrapped Marcus in a fierce embrace. "Gunny," Martinez said, his voice thick with emotion, "I knew you'd find your way back to us eventually." The room erupted as the other Marine surged forward, years of separation dissolving in an instant. These were men who had faced death together, who had trusted each other with their lives, and who had been bonded by experiences that few people could understand. As the initial excitement died down, Marcus found himself seated at the head of a table surrounded by faces that were older and grayer, but still unmistakably familiar. These were his Marines, the men who had followed him into the impossible and come home because of his leadership. The stories began to flow, what each man had done after leaving the service, the families they had raised, the careers they had built. "Every year we meet here," explained Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, now a successful businessman but still carrying the bearing of a Marine. "And every year we talk about the mission, about what we learned from you, about how what happened in Thailand shaped the rest of our lives. You taught us that impossible just means it takes a little longer." Marcus listened as each man shared how the mission had affected him, how the leadership and brotherhood they had experienced had influenced their civilian careers and family lives. They talked about the civilians they had rescued, several of whom had gone on to build successful lives in America, starting families and businesses that might never have existed without the courage of 13 Marines. But it was Martinez who brought up the subject that had been weighing on Marcus for decades. "Gunny, you saved my life that day, but not just by carrying me out. You saved all our lives by refusing to leave anyone behind. That's the kind of leader you were, the kind who made sure everyone came home no matter what the cost." "The cost was supposed to be me," Marcus said quietly. "If we hadn't stopped for you, if I hadn't insisted on carrying you out, the whole team would have made it to the extraction point safely. I put all of you at risk for one man." It was clear that this guilt had been eating at him for years, the weight of command decisions that could have resulted in disaster. The table fell silent for a moment before Staff Sergeant Williams, the team's former communications specialist, spoke up. "Sir, with respect, that's exactly why we followed you then and why we'd follow you now. You never left anyone behind. Ever. That wasn't a weakness, that was what made you the best team leader any of us ever served under." The conversation continued late into the evening, with each Marine sharing stories that revealed the lasting impact of Marcus's leadership style. They talked about how his insistence on thorough preparation had saved their lives multiple times, how his calm decision-making under fire had gotten them through impossible situations, and how his unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home had set a standard they had carried into their civilian lives. As the evening wound down, Colonel Mitchell stood to address the group. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we have an appointment at Marine Corps headquarters. The Commandant wants to meet the Thunder team, and there are some recognitions that are long overdue. Gunnery Sergeant Thompson, the Navy Cross that should have been awarded 20 years ago, will finally be presented, along with commendations for each member of this team." Marcus was stunned. The Navy Cross was the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. The fact that it had been approved but never presented due to the classified nature of the mission was a bureaucratic oversight that was finally being corrected. The ceremony at Marine Corps headquarters was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The room was filled with current and former Marines, including several general officers who had specifically requested to attend. As Marcus stood at attention while the Commandant read the citation for the Navy Cross, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from a grocery store parking lot where strangers had mocked, his tattoo to this room where his service was being honored at the highest levels. The citation detailed actions that most of the audience was hearing about for the first time, as the declassification of Operation Silent Thunder had only recently been approved. It described how Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thompson, had led a 12-man reconnaissance team into hostile territory to rescue 47 American civilians and Allied personnel trapped behind enemy lines. It detailed his tactical innovations, his courage under fire, and his refusal to abandon wounded team members even when it meant risking the entire mission. As the medal was pinned to his uniform, Marcus caught sight of his team members in the audience, all wearing their dress blues and standing at attention. Next to them were several civilians, men and women whose faces showed the passage of 20 years, but whose expressions of gratitude were unmistakable. These were some of the people his team had rescued, now successful Americans who had built lives and families in the safety that Marcus and his Marines had provided. After the ceremony, the reception provided an opportunity for Marcus to meet the people whose lives had been changed by Operation Silent Thunder. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been a young medical student trapped in the refugee camp, was now a prominent surgeon who had spent her career treating patients in underserved communities. "You gave me the chance to save lives," she told Marcus, tears in her eyes. "Every patient I've helped, every life I've saved, it all started with what you and your team did for us." James Patterson, who had been a relief worker caught behind enemy lines, had gone on to establish a foundation that provided medical care to refugees around the world. "Your courage didn't just save our lives that day," he told Marcus. "It inspired us to spend our lives helping others. The ripple effects of what you did are still spreading." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by his actions, directly and indirectly. The rescued civilians had gone on to become doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs, and parents. Their children and grandchildren existed because of a decision made by a Marine sergeant in a jungle clearing 20 years earlier. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Staff Sergeant David Rivera, the young Marine who had first recognized the significance of Marcus's tattoo, approached with his own news. "Sir, I wanted you to know that your story has already started making a difference. After Colonel Mitchell shared what happened in that parking lot, the Corps has started a new initiative. We're training Marines to recognize the signs of veterans who might be struggling with isolation or feeling forgotten. Too many of our brothers and sisters come home and feel like their service doesn't matter, like nobody remembers what they did," David continued. "Your story about how you were hiding in plain sight while people mocked what they didn't understand, it's helping us do better. We're making sure that every Marine knows how to spot a fellow warrior who might need support." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then rolled up his sleeve to look at the tattoo that had started it all. "You know, when I got this done, I thought it was just for me, a way to remember my brothers and honor the mission. I never imagined it would lead to all this." He gestured around the room, taking in the ceremony, the reunions, and the connections that had been restored. Colonel Mitchell joined the conversation, carrying a folder that he handed to Marcus. "Sir, there's one more thing. The Marine Corps History Division wants to interview you and your team for the official record. Your story will be included in the archive so that future Marines can learn from what you accomplished. And there's something else. We'd like you to consider coming to speak at the Command and Staff College. Your tactical decisions during Operation Silent Thunder are being used as case studies in leadership under extreme conditions." As the day ended and Marcus prepared to return home, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 3 weeks earlier, he had been an anonymous retiree enduring the mockery of strangers who saw only an old man with questionable tattoos. Today, he was a decorated hero surrounded by the Marines he had led and the civilians he had saved, with a future that included sharing his experiences with the next generation of military leaders. The greatest change, however, was personal. For 20 years, Marcus had carried the weight of his memories alone, believing that his service had been forgotten and that the sacrifices made during Operation Silent Thunder had disappeared into the classified archives of history. Now he knew that his actions had continued to matter, that the lives he had saved had gone on to save others, and that the Marines he had led still considered him their leader and their brother. As he walked out of Marine Corps headquarters, Marcus Thompson was no longer hiding in plain sight. The tattoo on his arm, which had once been a source of mockery and misunderstanding, had become the key that unlocked a door he never knew existed. A door that led back to his brothers, back to recognition, and back to a sense of purpose he thought he had lost forever. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter that would complete his transformation from forgotten veteran to honored hero. It was from a young Marine named Corporal Ashley Martinez, the daughter of the Marine he had carried to safety all those years ago. She was writing to inform him that she had just graduated from Marine boot camp and was requesting assignment to a reconnaissance unit, following in the footsteps of both her father and the man who had saved his life. "Dear Gunnery Sergeant Thompson," the letter began, "my father has told me the story of Operation Silent Thunder 1,000 times, but he always ends it the same way, by saying that I exist because of your courage and leadership. I want you to know that I'm not the only one. 3 of us Martinez kids became Marines, and we all carry the lessons my father learned from you. We know that impossible just means it takes a little longer, and we know that no Marine gets left behind." Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where he kept all the correspondence he had received since the ceremony, letters from the civilians he had rescued, from their children and grandchildren, from Marines who had been inspired by his story, and from military historians who wanted to document the lessons learned from Operation Silent Thunder. Each letter was a reminder that his service had mattered, that his sacrifice had meaning, and that the ripple effects of courage and leadership could continue for generations. The grocery store where it all began had become a regular stop for Marcus, but now he shopped there with a different perspective. When people noticed his tattoo, some still made assumptions, but others, especially those with military experience, approached him with respect and curiosity. He had learned to share his story when appropriate, not out of pride, but out of recognition that his experiences could help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. Most importantly, Marcus had discovered that he was not alone and never had been. The brotherhood he thought he had lost still existed, stronger than ever, and the legacy of Operation Silent Thunder continued to inspire new generations of Marines who understood that true leadership meant bringing everyone home, no matter the cost. His tattoo, once a source of ridicule, had become exactly what it was always meant to be: a memorial to courage, a testament to brotherhood, and a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how impossible they might seem.